Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Glad to be here.
So, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this, expectation of clinical precision.
Right.
Like, you break your arm, the X-ray shows a jagged white line, and the doctor just points and says, there it is. That's the fracture.
Yeah, exactly.
It's clean, it's binary, and honestly, it's kind of comforting, We like things to be visible and just easily categorized.
For sure. Because if you can point to the single point of failure, you know exactly where to apply the cast. I mean, a protocol is obvious.
Right. But then you step into the world of human crisis or societal breakdown or even like a collapsing corporate culture.
Yeah. That's a whole different thing.
Totally. And suddenly that X-ray machine is entirely useless. You're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is just unbelievably murky.
It's a mess.
Yeah. When a community or a nation is falling apart, you can't just point to a single bone. You're looking at this tangled web of external threats, internal corruption, collective exhaustion.
And just a complete loss of identity, usually.
Exactly.
And that kind of systemic failure requires a completely different type of intervention. You aren't just setting a bone, You're trying to revive an entire organism that is shutting down on multiple fronts simultaneously.
Which is incredibly daunting.
It is, and that is the exact landscape we are walking into today. We are going to examine one of the most remarkable historical case studies in crisis management, human psychology, and leadership ever recorded.
Which is the ancient text of Nehemiah, specifically the first 6 chapters.
Yes.
And to really get the weight of this deep dive, we need to set the historical stage. I want to make sure you, listening, understand the sheer scale of the problem here.
Right.
We are in the 20th year of Artaxerxes Longimanus, the Persian king. So that puts us right around, 445 or 444 BC?
Give or take, yeah, right around there.
So what does the world look like at this exact moment?
Well, the Persian Empire is, without question, the undisputed superpower of the ancient world. I mean, it stretches from India all the way over to Ethiopia.
Massive.
Huge. It's a wealthy, highly bureaucratic machine. And within this vast empire, you have the Jewish people.
Right.
Decades earlier, they had been conquered by Babylon, their temple was destroyed, and the population was dragged into exile.
Yeah.
But now, the Persians who conquered the Babylonians have allowed a remnant of the Jewish people to return to their ancestral homeland in Judah.
But, and we have to be clear here, this isn't some glorious, triumphant homecoming parade.
Not even a little bit.
Yeah.
They are back in Jerusalem, but the city is essentially a ghost town. It's a ghost of its former self.
Yeah.
They've managed to rebuild a modest temple, which is great, but the infrastructure of the city itself is non-existent. The walls of Jerusalem are in absolute ruins. The massive gates have literally been burned to ash.
Okay, let's pause on the walls for a second. Because if you live in a modern city today, a wall is just a decorative boundary, or maybe it's a sound barrier for a highway.
Right, it's an aesthetic choice.
Exactly. But in the ancient Near East, what does a destroyed wall actually mean for a population?
It means you have no economy, no identity, and absolutely zero security. I mean, think about it. Without a wall, you can't protect a market.
Which means trade is impossible.
Completely impossible. Anyone can walk in at any time and take your crops, your livestock, or, tragically, your children. You are entirely at the mercy of roaming bandits and hostile neighboring governors.
Wow.
Yeah. A city without walls in the ancient world wasn't really a city. It was just a target.
A target. That's a great way to put it. So the people living in Jerusalem are facing intense daily affliction and constant reproach.
Right. They are a traumatized, exposed community living in the literal rubble of their ancestors.
Okay, so we have this devastated community in Judah, but the protagonist of our story, Nehemiah, isn't there.
No, he's not.
He's not living in the rubble. He is hundreds of miles away in Susa, which is the winter capital of the Persian Empire.
Right.
And he's not a priest. He's not a prophet. He holds the title of the king's cupbearer.
Yes.
And I think people hear the word cupbearer, they picture like a glorified waiter, just some guy holding a tray. What is the actual reality of this job?
Yeah, that title is incredibly deceptive to modern ears. In the Persian court, the cupbearer was essentially the ultimate confidant. He was a high-ranking official of state.
Really?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Look, a Persian king's life was constantly under threat from assassination. And the primary method of assassination back then.
Poison.
Exactly. Poison. The cupbearer tasted the wine to ensure it was safe, which means he held the king's life in his hands every single day.
Wow. So you only give that job to someone whose loyalty is just absolutely unquestionable.
Precisely. You have
Wow.
to trust this person implicitly. And because of that trust, the cupbearer had direct, daily, intimate access to the most powerful monarch on the planet.
He's the gatekeeper.
He is. He controlled who had access to the king when the king was relaxed. He was an informal advisor. So Nehemiah is living in absolute luxury, likely surrounded by unimaginable wealth.
And he is completely insulated from the poverty and the danger back in his ancestral homeland.
Yes, entirely insulated.
But the insulation doesn't sever his emotional connection. And this is really where the narrative kicks into gear. Nehemiah gets a visit from his brother, Hanani, and some other men who have just traveled from Judah.
Right.
Nehemiah asks for a status report. And the news they bring him is just bleak. They tell him the remnant is in great affliction, the wall is broken down, and the gates are burned.
His reaction to this is really profound because he doesn't just shake his head and express sympathy. He doesn't just say, oh man, that's tough.
Right.
The text says he sits down, he weeps, and he mourns for days. He fasts and he prays.
I want to look closely at this prayer in chapter 1 because it's not a panic attack.
No.
It's not just him screaming at the sky saying, God, why is this happening to us? It is a deeply theological, structurally brilliant petition.
It really is. It's so grounded. He begins by recognizing the sovereignty of God, but then he moves immediately into confession. And notice how he phrases it. He confesses his own sins and the sins of his father's house.
Which is huge.
It is. He isn't pointing fingers at the people suffering in Jerusalem, blaming them for their plight. He owns the collective failure of his people.
He takes personal responsibility for a historical trauma. That's real leadership.
Exactly.
And then he does something really fascinating. He essentially quotes the book of Deuteronomy back to God.
Yeah, he does.
He reminds God of the ancient covenant made with Moses, that if the people transgressed, they would be scattered among the nations, but if they returned to the law, God would gather them from the uttermost parts of the heaven and bring them back.
He is anchoring his current chaotic crisis in ancient, immutable promises. He's establishing a theological foundation for what he's about to ask.
And what he asks for is highly specific.
Very specific. He asks God to grant him mercy in the sight of this man.
Meaning King Artaxerxes.
Yes. Nehemiah recognizes that the king holds the ultimate human authority over this situation, but he appeals to the God of heaven, which, by the way, is a very Persian title that the Jewish people adapted.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But he's recognizing that this God is sovereign even over the absolute monarch of Persia.
Okay, here is the part of the story that always catches me off guard. The timeline.
Ah, yes. The waiting period.
Right. He gets this devastating news in the month of Chislev. That correlates roughly to our, November or December?
Yes, late autumn, early winter.
But he doesn't actually bring this up to the king until the month of Nisan, which is March or April.
Right.
4 solid months go by. If you are devastated, if your people are suffering, why do you wait a third of a year to do something about it when you see the king every single day?
Because impulsive grief makes for terrible strategy.
Woof. Say that again? That's good.
Impulsive grief makes for terrible strategy. Look, Nehemiah is operating in a highly volatile political environment. You don't just interrupt the Persian king while he's dealing with, imperial taxation or a military campaign somewhere.
Right, you can't just barge in.
No, and you certainly don't demand a massive infrastructure project for a minor province out of the blue. Nehemiah is waiting for the exact right moment, the right mood, the right geopolitical opening.
He's reading the room on a macro scale.
Exactly. And he is spending those 4 months doing the agonizing, invisible work of planning.
Which totally pays off when the moment finally arrives. He's serving wine to the king in Nisan, and the text notes something critical. Nehemiah allows his sadness to show on his face.
Yes.
He had evidently been hiding it for 4 months. Why is showing a sad face such a big deal in this context?
You really have to understand the protocol of ancient absolute monarchies. The Persian king was viewed as the source of all blessing and happiness. To appear sad in his presence was an implicit criticism of his reign. It suggested that his presence wasn't enough to bring you joy.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, in many ancient courts, displaying unprovoked sorrow before the king was actually a capital offense. It was incredibly dangerous.
And the text doesn't hide that danger. It says Nehemiah was very sore afraid. The king looks at him and says, "Why is your countenance sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing else but sorrow of heart."
Which is a terrifying moment.
Terrifying, but Nehemiah's response is just a masterclass in emotional intelligence and diplomacy, because he doesn't blurt out, Jerusalem is destroyed.
No, he absolutely doesn't.
Yeah.
Because Jerusalem had a historical reputation in the empire as a rebellious city. If he says Jerusalem, the king's immediate thought goes to sedition.
Right. Rebellious vassal state.
Exactly.
So instead, Nehemiah frames it around a universal ancient value that even a Persian king respects deeply. He says, "Why shouldn't my countenance be sad when the city, the place of my father's sepulchres, lies waste, and the gates thereof are consumed with fire?"
It's brilliant.
He makes it about honoring the graves of his ancestors.
He completely bypasses the political trigger and hits the king on a human cultural level. Ancestor veneration was huge, and Artaxerxes is moved by it. So he asks the ultimate question: "For what dost thou make request?"
Basically, what do you want me to do?
Exactly.
And here we get this brilliant split-second mechanism. The text says, "So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king," it's just a momentary mental slash of a prayer.
He doesn't drop to his knees. He doesn't ask for a recess. In the microscopic pause between the king's question and his own answer, he fires off a silent plea for wisdom and articulation.
If you're listening to this deep dive right now and you've ever had to walk into, like, a brutal performance review,
Oh, yeah.
or you're about to negotiate a high-stakes contract, or even just face a tense confrontation with a family member, this is such a profound tool.
It really is. The arrow prayer.
Yes. You don't always have time to retreat to a mountaintop to find your center. But you can shoot that arrow of intention, that rapid internal request for clarity, right in the middle of the chaos before you open your mouth.
It acts as an instant psychological anchor. It centers you.
And because he anchored himself, and because he spent those 4 months planning, his answer to the king isn't some vague plea for help.
Right. He doesn't just ask for a leave of absence or something.
No, he asks for letters to the governors beyond the river to guarantee him safe passage. And he asks for a specific letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, to requisition timber for the gates, the wall, and the house he's going to live in.
He had the whole shopping list ready.
He did. But I want to drill down on those letters of safe passage for a second, because again, we think of modern passports, right? You just show a little booklet.
Yeah, but this is totally different.
So what is he actually asking for? How did you travel through a hostile empire in 444 BC?
Well, he is asking for official royal decrees, likely written on clay tablets or papyrus, and sealed with the king's unique signet ring. The bulla.
Okay.
The Persian Empire had an incredibly advanced highway system and a postal relay, but local governors were incredibly territorial.
Like warlords, almost.
Kind of. If Nehemiah shows up in the province of Beyond the River, which is this massive territory west of the Euphrates, with a military escort and a plan to rebuild a fortified city, the local governors will just slaughter him.
Because they'd see him as a threat.
Exactly. Those letters are his only shield. They tell the governors, "This man speaks with the authority of the throne. Touch him, and you go to war with Persia."
Wow. So he synthesizes this deep theological piety with absolute shrewd policy. Trusting Providence didn't stop him from understanding the granular details of, like, supply chain management and geopolitical bureaucracy.
No, the two work together perfectly.
So he gets the materials, he gets the royal escort, and he makes the long, dangerous journey to Jerusalem.
And when he finally arrives, his next move is highly counterintuitive.
Right.
Because he doesn't hold a massive rally. He doesn't read the king's letters in the public square to get everyone fired up. He rests for 3 days, telling absolutely no one what God has put in his heart to do.
Just totally quiet.
And then he conducts a secret night inspection.
The text describes him taking a few trusted men and riding his animal through the ruined gates in the dead of night. He's going to the valley gate, the dung gate, the fountain gate. He's out there in the dark, surveying the wreckage. But why the extreme secrecy? I mean, if you have the king's backing, why hide?
Because Nehemiah understands local politics. Jerusalem is surrounded by hostile factions who benefit from the city remaining weak.
Okay, that makes sense.
Furthermore, the internal leadership in Jerusalem, the nobles and rulers, are likely complacent or even corrupt. If Nehemiah announces his grand plan the moment he unpacks his bags, the opposition will mobilize their political connections before he even knows exactly how many bricks he needs.
He'd be shut down before he started.
Right. He has to quantify the exact scale of the problem before he can present a viable solution.
It's the ancient equivalent of a CEO doing a quiet, ruthless audit of a failing company. before pitching a massive turnaround strategy to a hostile board of directors.
That's a perfect analogy.
We don't walk in and shout, "I'm here to fix everything."
No.
You have to know where the bodies are buried. You have to know the exact depth of the ruin. Only after he has his own undeniable data does he call the priests, the nobles, and the rulers together.
And his pitch to them is masterful.
Yeah.
He doesn't scold them. He doesn't say, "Look at this mess you've made."
Right.
He says, "You see the distress that we are in? How Jerusalem lies waste?
Yeah.
Come, and let us build up the wall of Jerusalem, that we be no more a reproach."
The distress that we are in.
Yes, he includes himself in the crisis, and then he lays out the evidence of God's favor and the king's letters.
So he casts a vision backed by empirical reality and royal authority. And the response of the people is just immediate. They say, "Let us rise up and build."
It's amazing. He moves them from a state of paralyzing apathy to unified action just like that.
But having a willing crowd and actually organizing a massive engineering project are two very different things.
Which is exactly what Chapter 3 documents.
Right.
On the surface, if you read Chapter 3, it just looks like a massive, incredibly dry ledger of names and architectural features. So-and-so built this gate, so-and-so built that wall.
Yeah, it reads like a phone book.
It really does. But if you dig into the sociology of this chapter, it is a brilliant blueprint for how a fractured society rebuilds itself.
Let's look at who is actually doing the building. It starts with Eliashib, the high priest, and his fellow priests.
Yes.
They build the sheep gate and they consecrate it. This makes logical sense, right? Because the sheep gate was likely where the sacrificial animals were brought into the temple area.
Exactly.
But the fact that the spiritual elite of the city are out there doing heavy, brutal masonry sets a massive precedent. It destroys the idea that anyone is too holy or too important for manual labor.
It sets the tone for everybody else.
Totally. But then you look at the rest of the workforce, and it is wildly diverse.
It is. You have the men of Jericho who don't even live in Jerusalem pitching in to build the walls of the capital.
Commuters, basically.
Yeah. You have people identified by their specialized trades. We see goldsmiths. And even more surprisingly, we see apothecaries or perfumers assigned to sections of the wall.
Wait, hold on. A perfumer mixing mortar?
I know, right?
I'm sorry, but physically, how does that even work? A goldsmith or a perfumer spends their entire life doing highly delicate, micro-precise hand movements in a controlled environment. Now they are out in the blistering sun, hauling jagged, 100-pound limestone blocks and mixing heavy mortar.
It sounds absurd until you realize the depth of the crisis. When survival's on the line, the luxury of specialized job descriptions evaporates.
That's profound.
You don't get to say, "Well, my hands are too delicate for this."
Yeah.
When the city is completely defenseless. The crisis demanded that people step entirely outside their comfort zones. It was an all-hands-on-deck reality.
And we even see Shallum, the ruler of half the district of Jerusalem, building right alongside his daughters.
Yes, women contributing their physical labor.
Or potentially their vast wealth to fund the labor, right?
Okay.
But either way, directly to the infrastructure, it completely upends traditional societal roles.
It does.
But Nehemiah doesn't just randomly assign people to different spots on the wall. There is a very specific, deeply psychological strategy at play here.
Over and over in the text, you see this recurring phrase.
Yeah.
It will list a person's name and then say they repaired the wall over against his house or beside his own chamber.
He localized the motivation.
Yes. Nehemiah localized the motivation.
This is brilliant management. If you tell a guy to go build a random section of the wall on the total opposite side of the city, he might do an okay job. He'll put in his hours.
Sure.
But if you assign him the specific section of the wall that sits directly outside his own bedroom window,
Exactly.
the exact stones that are going to physically stand between a raiding army and his own children, how carefully is he going to mix that mortar?
He is going to make sure that section is impenetrable. Nehemiah beautifully aligns public duty with private interest. He understands human nature. People will fight hardest for what is immediately theirs.
But even with this brilliant strategy, there is one glaring, fascinating failure recorded in this chapter.
Yes. The Tekoites.
The Tekoites.
Yes. The men of Tekoa come to help. But the text explicitly calls out their leadership. It says, "Their nobles put not their necks to the work of their Lord."
They refused to submit to the yoke of the labor.
They did.
These are the classic stereotypical upper management aristocrats who think they are too good for the project. They won't get their hands dirty. And I find it endlessly fascinating and honestly a little terrifying that history recorded their laziness for thousands of years.
It's immortalized.
We are sitting here millennia later, calling out the nobles of Tekoa for avoiding hard work.
It's a permanent stain on their legacy.
Yeah.
But the beautiful counterpoint is that the ordinary men of Tekoa didn't let the laziness of their leaders stop them. The text shows that these commanders not only built their assigned section, but they actually went and repaired a second, completely different section of the wall to make up for the gap left by their nobles.
That's incredible. You know, if you're looking at your own workplace, your community, or your family right now, the lesson here is about overcoming the "that's not my department" mentality.
Absolutely.
True public spiritedness means picking up a trowel. Even if your title says you're a noble or a perfumer or a CEO, you don't have to fix the entire organization at once. Just start repairing the breach that is directly opposite your own house. Sweep before your own door first.
So true. So because of this massive localized collaboration, the wall starts going up with incredible speed. The people, as the text says, had a mind to work.
Momentum is building.
It is. But this introduces a fundamental rule of human endeavor.
Yeah.
Whenever you start making real progress, whenever you start rebuilding something that has been broken for a long time, you are going to attract resentment.
Yeah. The sound of building draws the attention of those who profited from the ruins. And this shifts our narrative from internal collaboration to intense external opposition.
Enter Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite.
Okay, who exactly are these guys, and why are they so angry about some stones being stacked?
Sanballat is likely the governor of Samaria, which is the region directly to the north of Judah. Tobiah is a powerful official of the Ammonites to the east.
Okay, so they're regional powers.
Exactly. And for decades, a weak, defenseless Jerusalem has been incredibly profitable for them. They could dictate trade, exact tribute, and exert political dominance over the region.
Ah, so a fortified Jerusalem completely disrupts their balance of power.
It's an existential threat to their regional control.
So when they hear the wall is going up, they are furious. But they don't immediately attack with an army. They start with psychological warfare. They use mockery and public humiliation. Sanballat gathers his army and his allies and starts mocking the Jews, saying, "What do these feeble Jews? Will they fortify themselves? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish?"
And Tobiah joins in with this incredibly cutting joke. He says, "Even that which they build, if a fox go up, he shall even break down their stone wall."
It's designed to induce massive imposter syndrome. They are yelling over the valley, essentially saying, "You aren't real builders. Your materials are garbage. A light little fox walking on your wall will cause the whole thing to collapse."
It's an attack on their competence and their dignity.
And how Nehemiah responds to this psychological attack is crucial. He doesn't yell back. He doesn't try to defend the engineering integrity of the wall. He turns his response entirely vertical.
He prays.
He prays a deeply harsh, visceral prayer. He says, "Hear, O our God, for we are despised, and turn their reproach upon their own head, and give them for a prey in the land of captivity, and cover not their iniquity, for they have provoked thee to anger before the builders."
Yeah, that's heavy.
It is, and we need to exercise some discernment here, because to modern ears, this sounds brutal. We are conditioned by ethical frameworks that emphasize praying for your enemies, forgiving those who wrong you, turning the other cheek.
Right.
Nehemiah is explicitly asking God to curse his enemies, to refuse to forgive their sins, and to drag them into captivity. How do we process this without just glossing over the discomfort?
It is uncomfortable, and we absolutely shouldn't sanitize it. But we have to understand the ancient context of existential warfare.
Okay.
Nehemiah doesn't view Sanballat and Tobiah as just annoying coworkers or political rivals. He views them as active agents of chaos, attempting to destroy a vulnerable people and thwart the redemptive work of God. In his mind, an attack on the builders is an attack on the divine cosmic order.
So he's asking for cosmic justice, not just petty personal revenge.
Exactly. While we might not replicate the specific curse today, the psychological mechanism here is profoundly healthy.
How so?
Nehemiah is experiencing intense, raw human rage. But instead of acting out violently, instead of, sending assassins into Samaria, he channels that unfiltered emotion into his petition to God.
He offloads it.
Yes, he offloads the burden of vengeance. He essentially says, "I am too angry to deal with this, God. You handle them." And then He immediately goes back to work.
And the work progresses. The text says the wall reached half its height.
Yes, the halfway point.
But right at this halfway point, a completely new, far more dangerous problem emerges. It's not the mockery from the outside, it's the physical and mental exhaustion from the inside.
The people of Judah come to Nehemiah and they complain. They say, the strength of the bearers of burdens is decayed, and there is much rubbish, so that we are not able to build the wall.
This is a brilliant, timeless psychological insight. The halfway point of any massive endeavor is always the most dangerous.
Always.
Why is that? I mean, shouldn't you feel good that you're half done?
You'd think so. But at the beginning, you are running on the pure adrenaline of a new vision. And near the end, you are pulled forward by the sight of the finish line.
Right.
But right in the middle, the initial excitement has completely evaporated, and the finish line is still too far away to provide motivation. You look around, and all you see is the grueling reality of the work.
You're just stuck in it.
Yeah. For the builders in Jerusalem, they are looking at massive piles of charred stones, dirt, and debris. Their bodies are breaking down, and their mental resolve is fracturing under the sheer volume of the rubbish.
It's the messy middle. Think about renovating an old house. Month 1 is all vision boards, excitement, and swinging sledgehammer.
Oh, yeah. Demo day is fun.
Demo day is great, but by month 4, you've spent twice your budget, you've been breathing drywall dust for weeks, your kitchen is a plastic tarp, and you are just surrounded by exhausting debris. You hit that exact wall where you look at your spouse and say, we are not able to do this.
We made a huge mistake.
Exactly, and it is exactly at this moment of maximum internal vulnerability that the external enemies decide to escalate. Mockery didn't stop the wall, so Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabians, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites conspired to launch a coordinated physical surprise attack.
They plan to infiltrate the city and slaughter the builders in the rubble.
Terrifying. And the rumors of this attack start filtering in. Jews who live in the surrounding villages come running into Jerusalem, warning Nehemiah over and over 10 times. The text says that an attack is coming from all sides.
So we have exhausted, terrified people surrounded by rubbish, facing a multinational military coalition.
What does Nehemiah do?
He prays.
He prays. But verse 9 is where we see the absolute brilliance of his leadership. It says, nevertheless, we made our prayer unto our God, and he set a watch against them day and night.
This perfectly resolves the age-old philosophical tension between trusting divine providence and exercising human agency. Nehemiah believes entirely that God is sovereign and will protect them. But he does not believe that trusting God excuses him from practical, physical vigilance.
He doesn't say, God's got this, put down your weapons and take a nap.
Far from it. He arms the families with swords, spears, and bows. He places them in the lowest, most vulnerable gaps in the wall.
And he stands up before the nobles and the rulers and issues the stunning rallying cry. He says, be not afraid of them. Remember the Lord, which is great and terrible, and fight for your brethren, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your houses.
Notice he doesn't say fight for the wall.
Right. He makes it deeply personal. Fight for your children. Fight for your spouses.
And when the enemies realize the element of surprise is gone, that the city is armed and waiting, they back off. But Nehemiah refuses to let his guard down. He institutes a radical dual system of labor and defense.
The sword and the trowel.
Exactly. Half of his servants work on construction, while the other half hold the spears, the shields, the bows, and the armor. And for the actual builders on the wall, they have to carry loads with one hand and hold a weapon in the other. Every single builder has a sword girded by his side while he works.
Okay, I have to push back on the physical reality of this.
Fair enough.
If I am carrying a load of rocks or mixing heavy mortar, I literally cannot do that with one hand while holding a heavy bronze sword in the other. How does this actually work on ancient scaffolding?
Well, it's likely a description of immediate readiness, rather than literal one-handed masonry. The text says the burden bearers, the people carrying the baskets of rubble and dirt, could do their jobs with one hand while holding a javelin in the other.
Okay, that makes more sense.
But the actual masons setting the stones had their swords strapped to their waists, ready to draw in a fraction of a second. Nehemiah also implements a centralized alarm system.
Because they're spread out.
Exactly. Because the wall is massive and the workers are spread thin, he keeps a trumpeter right next to him at all times.
Yeah.
If an attack happens at one gate, he blows the horn, and the entire workforce drops their trowels, draws their swords, and rallies to that specific location.
The psychological toll of this hypervigilance must have been staggering. The text says they didn't even take off their clothes at night. They slept fully armed. They only took off their garments to wash them.
It is the ultimate picture of the sword and the trowel. And you can translate that to today. The trowel represents the actual grueling daily work of building your life, your career, your community.
Yes.
The sword represents the constant vigilance required to protect that work from the setbacks, distractions, and toxic influences that want to tear it down.
Yeah.
You cannot build anything of lasting value if you aren't simultaneously willing to defend it.
That is so true. But just when they have fortified the walls against the armies outside and they've managed to push through the physical exhaustion, a completely different kind of crisis detonates.
Chapter 5.
Chapter 5. And this one doesn't come from Sanballat or Tobiah. It comes from inside the city. And it threatens to completely cannibalize the entire society.
We are moving from physical engineering to social and economic engineering.
Right. In Chapter 5, the construction of the wall grinds to a complete halt because a massive, agonizing cry arises from the common people against their own Jewish brethren.
We really have to unpack the macroeconomic factors that create this crisis. What exactly is happening to the economy of Judah right now?
Okay, it's a perfect storm of three catastrophic financial pressures. First, there is a severe famine in the land. Food is scarce, which means grain prices are sky high.
Supply and demand.
Exactly. Second, the Persian Empire doesn't care about your local famine. They still demand heavy imperial taxes tribute paid in silver.
Which nobody has.
Right. And third, because the entire able-bodied population has been drafted to build this wall for 52 days straight, they are not tending their own farms, they aren't working their vineyards, and they aren't running their trades. The common people have absolutely zero income.
They are completely destitute.
And who steps in to take advantage of this?
The wealthy Jewish nobles and rulers, their own brothers.
Yes. The elite class has surplus capital, and they use it to exploit the crisis. They loan money and grain to the poor so they can eat and pay the Persian tax, but they charge an exorbitant interest rate.
The Talmud describes it as the 100th part of the money, which historians believe was exacted monthly. That translates to a 12% annual interest rate.
Now, wait. A modern listener might hear a 12% interest rate and think, honestly, my credit card charges 22%. 12% isn't that bad. Why is this destroying the society?
It's a great question, but we are projecting modern industrial capitalism onto an ancient agrarian society.
Okay, explain the difference.
In a modern economy, you take out a loan at 12% to start a business. The business grows at 20%, you pay off the loan, and you build wealth. It's productive debt.
Right. It leverages growth.
Exactly. But in the ancient world, there is no compounding corporate growth. You are borrowing seed grain just to keep your family from starving. If the harvest fails again, you can't pay the 12%. So what happens? You have to secure the loan by mortgaging your ancestral field, your vineyard, your house.
And when the next famine hits and you still can't pay?
You default. The wealthy noble seizes your land. Now you have no way to ever produce food or income again. You are entirely stripped of your economic agency.
And it gets worse.
It gets much worse. The final horrifying step of ancient agrarian debt is human collateral. To pay off the compounding debt and keep from starving, the poor families are forced to sell their own sons and daughters into slavery to their wealthy neighbors.
The people cry out to Nehemiah saying, "Our flesh is as the flesh of our brethren, our children as their children. And lo, we bring into bondage our sons and our daughters to be servants. Neither is it in our power to redeem them, for other men have our lands." It's a heartbreaking, trapped reality.
And we need to make a crucial observation here. By the brutal, laissez-faire market standards of the ancient Near East, what the nobles were doing was entirely legal.
Technically legal.
Technically legal. They had capital, the market demanded liquidity, and they were maximizing their profit during a shortage. They were operating entirely within the rules of ancient commerce.
Right. And as a reminder, we are not taking any modern political sides here regarding capitalism, socialism, or modern banking systems. We are purely analyzing Nehemiah's ancient socioeconomic intervention.
Right, in his specific context.
Because Nehemiah sees this technically legal practice and identifies it as a profound moral failure. When he hears what is happening, his reaction is explosive. The text says, "I was very angry when I heard their cry."
But anger, while justified, can be incredibly destructive if it isn't regulated. And here we get one of the most powerful phrases in the entire book. In verse 7, Nehemiah says, "Then I consulted with myself."
Yeah, I love that line so much. I consulted with myself. He doesn't immediately storm out of his house and start executing the nobles. He takes his rage and he processes it internally. He regulates his emotion.
It's the ancient equivalent of drafting a blistering, scorched earth email to your boss.
And then forcing yourself to leave it in the drafts folder overnight before deciding whether to hit send.
Yes, anger is the appropriate engine for fighting injustice. But unregulated anger will just burn down whatever is left of the city. He formulates a precise, devastating argument, and then he acts.
So what does he do?
He calls a great public assembly. He brings the issue entirely into the light. He publicly rebukes the nobles and rulers, saying, "You exact usury every one of his brother."
And the logic he uses to shame them is brilliant. He points out that he and other Jews in Persia had been spending their own personal wealth to buy back Jewish slaves from the surrounding heathen nations.
Yes.
He says, "We just spent a fortune redeeming our brothers from foreigners, and you are turning right around and enslaving them to each other."
He exposes the total hypocrisy of their actions. He tells them, "Ought ye not to walk in the fear of our God because of the reproach of the heathen, our enemies?" He's essentially saying, the surrounding nations are watching us eat our own children. Stop.
But he doesn't just demand that they stop charging interest moving forward. He demands total, immediate, systemic restitution. Give back the lands, give back the olive yards, forgive the debt, return the children. Today.
To seal this demand, he performs a highly dramatic, terrifying prophetic gesture.
The lap shake.
The lap shake. He takes the fold of his garment, his lap shakes it out violently in front of the assembly and says, "So God shake out every man from his house and from his labor, that performeth not this promise."
It's an enacted curse. He is publicly stating before God, if you break this promise to forgive these debts, may God completely empty your life and your wealth, just as I am emptying the lint from my pockets.
And the pressure works. The nobles are trapped by the moral clarity of the argument. They say, "We will restore them." And the entire congregation praises the Lord.
But we have to ask why Nehemiah's leadership worked here. Why did the wealthy elite actually submit to this massive financial loss?
Because Nehemiah had absolute moral authority. He wasn't a hypocrite demanding sacrifices from others that he wasn't willing to make himself. He reveals that for his entire 12 years as governor of Judah, he and his brethren refused to eat the bread of the governor.
Okay, explain the bread of the governor. What does that mean?
As the Persian-appointed governor, Nehemiah had a legal right to heavily tax the people to fund his administration, his table, and his lavish lifestyle.
Which was standard practice.
Totally standard. Former governors had done exactly that, burdening the people with taxes of silver, bread, and wine. But Nehemiah looked at the extreme poverty of the people and voluntarily gave up his legal rights. Furthermore, he didn't use his insider knowledge or immense wealth to buy up cheap land during the famine, which he easily could have done. Instead, he fed 150 Jewish officials and visiting dignitaries at his own table out of his own pocket every single day. Why? The text says, because the bondage was heavy upon this people.
Leadership requires moral authority, not just positional authority. Nehemiah could demand that the nobles leave money on the table because he was actively leaving massive amounts of money on the table for the sake of the community's survival.
He subordinated his personal profit to the collective good.
If we look at our own lives, our business practices, or how we treat the people under our authority, we have to ask ourselves, are we leveraging someone else's desperate situation for our own gain?
Are we operating entirely within the rules of the system but completely violating the spirit of community?
Exactly. You cannot build a secure wall around a society that is rotting from greed on the inside.
And by fixing that internal rot, Nehemiah saves the project. Economic justice is restored, the community bond is healed, and the work resumes with furious speed. The wall nears completion. All the breaches are filled. Only the massive wooden doors for the gates remain to be hung.
But the enemies outside are not done. Which brings us to the climax of the narrative in chapter 6, the psychology of distraction and gaslighting.
Yes.
If Sanballat and Tobiah can't break the physical wall with an army, and they can't break the society with economic collapse, they have one last desperate tactic. They are going to try to break the psychology of the leader himself. They shift their attack entirely from the project to the person.
Sanballat and Geshem the Arabian completely change their tune. The threats of violence disappear, and suddenly they're acting like reasonable diplomats.
Right, let's talk.
Yeah. They send a message to Nehemiah saying, "Come, let us meet together in one of the villages in the plain of Ono." It sounds like a sophisticated invitation to a peace conference, a diplomatic summit to iron out their differences.
But Nehemiah isn't naive. The plain of Ono is located near the border of Samaria and Ashdod, which is enemy territory.
Yes.
He knows it's an ambush. They want to draw him out of the highly fortified security of Jerusalem to either assassinate him or kidnap him.
And 4 times they send this persistent, nagging invitation.
4 times.
And 4 times Nehemiah sends back one of the most legendary boundary-setting replies in human history. I am doing a great work so that I cannot come down. Why should the work cease whilst I leave it and come down to you?
He utterly refuses to be distracted. He refuses to legitimize their false diplomacy. So the 5th time, Sanballat escalates to a vicious new tactic. He sends his servant to Nehemiah with an open letter in his hand.
Now, why does the text specify an open letter? What does that mean in ancient diplomacy?
Good question.
In the ancient world, official letters between leaders were rolled up and sealed with clay or wax. Only the intended recipient was supposed to break the seal.
Right, it was private.
An open letter meant the document was unsealed. It was designed to be read by every single courier, guard, and merchant along the route. It wasn't a private communication. It was a public broadcast.
It is the ancient equivalent of leaking a fabricated document to the press.
It's a viral smear campaign. And the contents of the letter are pure, engineered fake news.
Let's hear it.
Sanballat writes, "It is reported among the heathen, and Gashmu saith it, that thou and the Jews think to rebel. For which cause thou buildest the wall, that thou mayest be their king. Come now, therefore, and let us take counsel together."
We have to understand the sheer danger of this lie. If rumors reach King Artaxerxes back in Persia that Nehemiah is using the king's timber to fortify a rebel city and crown himself king of Judah, the Persian army will march west and annihilate Jerusalem.
Sanballat is trying to incite massive panic. He wants Nehemiah to freak out, go on the defensive, drop everything he's doing, and rush to the plain of Ono to beg Sanballat to suppress the rumor.
But look at Nehemiah's absolute, unshakable discernment. He doesn't take the bait.
He doesn't.
He doesn't call a press conference. He doesn't over-explain himself. He sends a flat, one-sentence denial. "There are no such things done as thou sayest, but thou feignest them out of thine own heart." You completely made that up.
And then he prays, "Oh God, strengthen my hands," and turns right back to the wall. He refuses to let anxiety dictate his schedule.
But the enemy tries one final trap, and this one is arguably the most insidious because it is an inside job clothed in heavy religious language.
Yes. They hire a man named Shemaiah, a presumed prophet living in Jerusalem. Nehemiah goes to Shemaiah's house, and Shemaiah acts terrified, claiming he has received a divine warning. He says, "Let us meet together in the house of God within the temple, and let us shut the doors of the temple, for they will come to slay thee. Yea, in the night will they come to slay thee."
Now, on the surface, this sounds like a friend trying to save Nehemiah's life. He's offering him sanctuary in the most secure building in the city. Why is this a trap?
Because it requires deep theological and constitutional discernment to see through it. Under Jewish law, as explicitly laid out in the book of Numbers, the inner sanctuary of the temple was strictly reserved for the priests.
Okay.
For a layman like Nehemiah, even if he was the governor, to enter the holy place was a severe desecration. It was a capital offense against God's law.
Oh, I see. If Nehemiah, the great reformer and leader, violated the sacred constitutional law of his own people just to save his own skin, he would have instantly destroyed his moral authority.
Exactly. The people would have branded him a coward and a blasphemer. He would have lost the trust of the very people he was trying to lead.
And Nehemiah sees right through the spiritual manipulation. He responds, "Should such a man as I flee? And who is there that, being as I am, would go into the temple to save his life? I will not go in."
He realizes immediately that God hasn't sent this guy. Sanballat and Tobiah hired him, along with a false prophetess named Noadiah and others, to induce fear.
This is such a powerful lesson. Just because someone sounds deeply spiritual, just because they use religious language or claim to have special insight into your life, does not mean they are speaking truth. True wisdom, true discernment does not lead you to violate your core principles out of fear.
Nehemiah protects his integrity above his physical safety.
And because he maintained his focus, because he established ruthless boundaries, and because he refused to be intimidated by gaslighting or false prophets, the impossible was finally achieved.
Which brings us to the stunning climax of the narrative, chapter 6, verse 15.
So the wall was finished in the 25th day of the month, Elul, in 52 days.
52 days. It is a staggering, almost incomprehensible feat of engineering and leadership. After lying in charred ruins for over a century, the massive defenses of Jerusalem are completely rebuilt in less than 2 months.
And the psychological effect on the surrounding region is profound. The text tells us that when all their enemies heard about it, and the surrounding heathen nations saw the finished wall, they were much cast down in their own eyes, for they perceived that this work was wrought of our God.
The very people who mocked them, who said a fox would knock the stones over, were now deeply demoralized. They had to recognize that a higher power was at work through this unified people.
It's an incredible triumph of vision, administration, and perseverance.
It really is.
It is. But we want to leave you with one final, lingering, and frankly sobering thought to mull over. Something that builds on everything we've analyzed today, but kind of flips the perspective.
Yeah, this last detail is crucial.
At the very end of chapter 6, right after the wall is finished and the triumph is secured, the author includes this dark, incredibly unsettling little footnote.
It says that even in those days, the nobles of Judah, the very same guys who refused to work on the wall, the same guys who exploited the poor, were still sending many secret letters out of the city to Tobiah, the enemy.
Why? Why are they writing to the guy who literally tried to kill them?
Because Tobiah was bound to them by marriage. He was the son-in-law of a prominent Jewish leader, and his son had married a Jewish woman. There was an active internal spy network operating the entire time. The nobles were reporting Nehemiah's words and actions to Tobiah, and they were bringing Tobiah's letters into the city to frighten Nehemiah.
So here is the provocative thought for you to explore on your own. You can work yourself to the bone. You can build a massive, impenetrable 50-foot stone wall in 52 days to keep your external enemies out. You can fend off the armies of Sanballat and Tobiah. But a physical wall cannot protect you if you have already invited toxic influences into your inner circle and actively married yourself to them.
That's a powerful point.
What external walls are we frantically building in our own lives, our careers, or our families to feel secure, while completely ignoring the internal compromises we've already made? If the massive wooden gates are finally locked, but the enemy is already sitting comfortably at your dinner table, the wall doesn't matter.
It forces us right back to our opening metaphor. The diagnostic X-ray of a broken system, or a human heart, is never a clean, simple line. The muddiest, most dangerous waters aren't the hostile armies threatening you from outside the walls. They're the corrupted loyalties operating quietly inside.
That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.